In the cold January of 1944, there was a mountain in the heart of Italy, but this was no ordinary mountain. This mountain would become the stage for one of history's bloodiest scenes, Monte Cassino. Perhaps you've heard this name before, perhaps you haven't, but let me tell you this, if you listen to this story until the end, you might have trouble sleeping at night. Because what I'm about to tell you are truths you won't even see in Hollywood movies. If you enjoy listening to lesser-known stories of British soldiers in World War II, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there are many videos like this on this channel, and many more are on the way. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. Now close your eyes and transport yourself to Italy in 1944. The Normandy landings are still months away. Much of Europe groans under Nazi occupation, and Allied forces face a massive obstacle on the road to Rome, the Gustav Line. This line was Germany's strongest defensive position in Italy, and the heart of this line beat in the shadow of a 1,500-year-old monastery atop Monte Cassino. This was where Britain's bravest soldiers, Nepal's legendary Gurkha warriors, and Polish exiles fighting thousands of miles from home stood shoulder to shoulder. This was where one of the most controversial decisions in modern military history was made, and this was the center of the most bitter and bloody battles the British Army faced against the Germans in World War II. If this is your first time watching this channel, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Because here we uncover stories buried in the dusty pages of history every day. Now let's step into the dark world of Monte Cassino. The Gustav Line was a massive defensive system stretching approximately 160 kilometers across the Italian peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. But the most critical point of this line was Monte Cassino, which controlled the entrance to the Liri Valley. At the summit stood one of Christianity's most important monasteries, founded by Saint Benedict in 529 AD. This monastery was not just a religious center, but also one of the cradles of Western civilization. Throughout the Middle Ages, manuscripts were preserved here, and science and art flourished. But now this sacred place was about to meet the most merciless face of war. The Germans had employed a clever strategy. They didn't occupy the monastery itself, but they established extremely strong defensive positions on the surrounding slopes, valleys, and hills. Barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and well-camouflaged machine gun nests. Every inch of ground was a death trap. And worst of all, that massive white monastery at the summit appeared to be used as an observation point from which every Allied movement could be watched. This is where British soldiers entered the scene. On January 17th, the British 10th Corps under Lieutenant General Richard McCreery launched the first assault. The 5th and 56th Infantry Divisions crossed the Garigliano River and attacked German positions. These men came from all corners of England, from the streets of London, the Highlands of Scotland, the mining towns of Wales. They had left families behind, said goodbye to loved ones. Most were in their early 20s, and now they were trying to survive on one of history's most brutal battlefields. From the first days of battle, British soldiers realized they had fallen into the heart of hell. The Germans seemed to anticipate every attack. One British officer said, "You couldn't even scratch yourself without being watched, and it was psychological. That monastery felt alive, as if it were watching our every move." Soldiers were mowed down by German artillery fire while advancing across open ground. Every step could potentially be the last. The British 46th Infantry Division attempted to cross the river where the Garigliano meets the Liri. In the darkness of night, soldiers advancing through cold water found themselves in the heart of hell when they reached the opposite bank. German machine guns opened fire from every direction, mortar shells lit up the sky, and that night hundreds of young British soldiers lost their lives. But they didn't give up, they didn't retreat. because they knew that behind them stood an entire world, families, loved ones, a dream of the future, and before them, an enemy that had to be defeated. By mid-February, Allied command was forced to make a critical decision. Should the monastery be bombed? This question posed one of the war's greatest moral dilemmas. On one side, a 1,500-year-old sacred structure, one of the legacies of Western civilization. On the other, thousands of Allied soldiers dying, wounded, and maimed every day, and a widespread belief that the monastery was being used by the Germans as an observation point. What would you do in such a situation? A very difficult decision. Share your thoughts in the comments. American Fifth Army Commander General Mark Clark was against the bombing. There were intelligence reports indicating the Germans weren't inside the monastery. Some officers fighting at the front had even reported that enemy fire was coming from the slopes below, not from the monastery itself. But for the soldiers fighting at the front, that massive white structure was like a nightmare. Every time they looked at it, they felt they were being watched. Finally, on the morning of February 15, 1944, the decision was made. 142 Boeing B-17 heavy bombers, followed by 47 B-25 Mitchells and 40 Martin B-26 Marauders, filled the sky. 1,150 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs rained down on the monastery. Allied soldiers and war correspondents watching from the valley below applauded as the bombs fell. One American soldier shouted, "Touchdown," when the last bomb dropped. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and leave a like. But these cries of victory would soon turn to silence. The bombing produced an unexpected result. The monastery's ruins became a perfect defensive position for German paratroopers. Germans who hadn't been inside the monastery before now settled among the rubble. Piles of stone transformed into ideal cover for machine gun nests. Collapsed walls and deep craters provided natural fortifications for the defenders. Ironically, the destruction of the monastery had made the Germans' job easier. And worse still, more than 140 Italian civilians who had remained inside the monastery during the bombing lost their lives. These were innocent villagers who had fled the war and sought refuge in the sacred place. After the bombing, a company of the British Royal Sussex Regiment attacked Hill 593. This hill was a strategic point just below the monastery, and that assault turned into a disaster. The company suffered over 50% casualties. On February 16th, the regiment attacked again at full strength. The result was the same. German paratroopers pushed the British back. This is where one of history's most legendary warriors entered the scene, the Gurkhas. These men from the mountains of Nepal were one of the most feared units in the British Army. Having fought for the British crown since the 19th century, the Gurkhas had earned fame for their courage and loyalty, and each carried a legendary weapon passed down through generations, the kukri. This curved blade wasn't just a weapon, it was part of the Gurkha identity, and at Monte Cassino, these blades would be stained with blood. On the night of February 17th, the 1st and 9th Gurkha Rifle Regiments, along with the 4th and 6th Rajputana Rifles, attacked the monastery. The Gurkhas were born to fight in mountainous terrain. They had grown up on the harsh slopes of the Himalayas, and commanders hoped these mountain warriors would succeed on Monte Cassino's rocky slopes. But this hope quickly turned to despair. The Germans could see every movement. Every attack was met with machine gun fire and mortar shells. The Rajputana Rifles lost 196 officers and men. The 9th Gurkha Regiment lost 149, and the 1st Gurkha Regiment 96. The assault had failed. But the Gurkhas would create a legend at Monte Cassino. In the third assault in March, the 9th Gurkha Rifle Regiment captured Hangman's Hill, just 300 meters from the monastery. This hill had gotten its name from criminals who had been hanged there, and now this grim name would take on new meaning. The Gurkhas conquered Hill 435 and reached the closest point to enemy positions. German resistance was stubborn. Both sides fought for every inch. In close-quarter combat, the Gurkhas drew their kukri knives. Hand-to-hand combat ensued. On dark nights, Gurkhas silently infiltrating German trenches became the enemy's worst nightmare. A British officer described those days. "Watching the Gurkhas, I truly understood what war meant. These men didn't know fear, or they knew it but didn't care. In the darkness, they would slip into enemy trenches without a sound, and then silence. By morning, the German positions would be empty." But Hangman's Hill became more of a prison than a victory. The Gurkhas had captured the hill but were trapped there. Ammunition and supplies were running low. Relief convoys couldn't get through under German fire. As days passed, the situation grew more desperate. Finally, when it became clear that a broader breakthrough wasn't possible, the Gurkhas were forced to withdraw. The first 3 battles of Monte Cassino had been a disaster for Allied forces. Thousands of soldiers had died or been wounded, and that cursed hill was still in German hands. But the story doesn't end here, because in May, a new force would enter the stage. A people driven from their homes, their families massacred, their homeland occupied. The Poles. And with them, Monte Cassino's bloodiest, most dramatic, and most unforgettable scenes would be written. In the next part, I'll tell you how Polish soldiers reached Monte Cassino, their incredible journey from Soviet gulags to Italian hills. I'll share General Anders' legendary speech, how they fought shoulder to shoulder with Gurkha and British soldiers, and the details of what happened during those bloody days in May. This isn't just a war story. This is the story of how hope, courage, and brotherhood can shine even in humanity's darkest moments. And you will witness this story. Subscribe and like for this valuable story. Now let's continue. Welcome back to Part 2, everyone. We're continuing our story without slowing down. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments as well. Now, if you're ready, let's move on to the most dramatic part of our story. To understand how Polish soldiers reached Monte Cassino, we first need to know where they came from. And this story begins on one of the darkest pages of World War II. September 1939. Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west, the Soviet Union from the east. 2 dictators, 2 monsters, tore a country apart. Stalin took eastern Poland, Hitler took the rest, and this disaster was only the beginning. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, launched a systematic cleansing operation. More than 1 million Poles were torn from their homes. Women, children, the elderly, soldiers, all were crammed into unheated cattle cars. Hellish journeys lasting days, weeks. They were exiled to the frozen lands of Siberia, the desert steppes of Kazakhstan, the merciless cold of the Arctic Circle. Such a tragic situation. Gulag. This word was death itself. In forced labor camps, people died from starvation, cold, disease, and torture. 1 in 4 never saw their homeland again. Families were torn apart. Children were orphaned, and thousands of Poles were buried in nameless graves in frozen ground. But in this darkness, a ray of hope would emerge. In June 1941, Hitler betrayed his ally Stalin and attacked the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the Soviets found themselves on the same side as Britain and America, and Stalin desperately needed every soldier he could get. This is where a miracle that would go down in history as Anders' army began. General Władysław Anders was a Polish cavalry commander who had been held in Soviet prisons since 1939. He had been tortured for months in Moscow's infamous Lubyanka prison. But in August 1941, he was suddenly released. His mission? To form a Polish army on Soviet soil. Anders got to work immediately. First, he had to ensure that news of the amnesty reached Poles in the gulags. But this wasn't easy. Soviet bureaucracy was slow and hostile. Many prisoners received this news months later. Some never received it at all. Those who learned of the amnesty had to fend for themselves. Thousands tried to reach assembly points thousands of kilometers away, most on foot. Buzaluk, between Moscow and the Ural Mountains, was one of the first assembly points. The people who arrived here looked like living skeletons, bellies swollen from hunger, frostbite marks, signs of disease. But there was a light in their eyes, the hope of freedom. By November 1941, most of the soldiers were without shoes. Snow covered the tents and shelters. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. But Anders didn't give up. He continued to organize his army. He established hospitals. He formed women's auxiliary service units. He rescued hundreds of women and girls, making them an indispensable part of the armed forces. Building an independent Polish army in the Soviet Union was unthinkable. Stalin wanted to use these soldiers under his own command, but Anders and his men were determined to fight alongside the Western Allies. Finally, thanks to an agreement with the British, the Poles were evacuated from Soviet territory. The first evacuation began in March 1922. 4,300 people crossed into Iran. Then larger evacuations followed. In the end, 41,000 soldiers and 74,000 civilians escaped the Soviet hell. But many Poles were left behind. Stalin declared them Soviet citizens and forced them to continue working or serving in the Red Army. This is unfortunately one of the many cruel faces of war. Those who reached Iran were starting a new life. Anders' army officially became known as the Polish Armed Forces in the East, and during this period, one of history's strangest military stories began. One day, while Polish soldiers were walking through the mountainous regions of Iran, they encountered a boy carrying a small bear cub in his arms. The bear's mother had been killed, and the cub was hungry, sick, and dying. The soldiers bought the bear for a few cans of food. They named him Wojtek. In Polish, this name means "he who enjoys war" or "joyful warrior." Wojtek quickly became the unit's mascot, but he was much more than an ordinary mascot. For these men who had lived through hell for years, far from their homes and families, Wojtek was a family member, a brother, a child. They wrestled with him, played with him, slept beside him. Wojtek learned to drink beer, even to eat cigarettes. He loved riding in the front seats of trucks. But Wojtek's real fame would be earned at Monte Cassino. Now, let's return to Italy. In the spring of 1944, Allied command was desperate. 3 bloody assaults had failed to capture Monte Cassino. Americans, British, New Zealanders, Indians, Gurkhas, French, all had been tried, all had failed. British 8th Army Commander General Oliver Leese summoned General Anders to his headquarters. He offered him the mission that other Allied units had failed, to take Monte Cassino. Anders knew what this offer meant. He knew his men would suffer heavy casualties, but he was also aware of how delicate Poland's political situation was. The Soviets were becoming increasingly hostile to Poland's independence. A victory won on such a famous battlefield could change his country's fate. Anders and his chief of staff, General Wisniewski, had a brief discussion. Then they turned to Leese and accepted the mission. This wasn't just a military decision. This was a nation's struggle for honor and survival. On the night of May 11, 1944, Anders delivered his legendary speech to his soldiers. "Soldiers, my dear brothers and children, the hour of battle has come. We have long awaited this moment of revenge and retribution. We shall fight shoulder to shoulder with British, American, Canadian, and New Zealand divisions. The French, Italians, and Indians will also fight. Let the lion spirit awaken in your hearts. Soldiers, remembering Germany's bandit attack on Poland, the German-Soviet occupation, thousands of destroyed cities and towns, thousands of murdered and tortured brothers, millions of Poles deported as slaves to Germany, our country's pain and sorrow, the suffering and exile we endured, trusting in divine justice with the sacred slogan, God, Honor, Homeland, we march forward. These words echoed in every Polish soldier's heart. They weren't just fighting to capture a hill, they were fighting for their homeland, for their families, for their honor. British observers watched the Polish soldiers' preparations for battle with amazement. One British officer wrote, "I had never seen anyone so full of hatred. All they wanted was to kill Germans." These men had wept for their families in the gulags. They had learned that their officers had been massacred at Katyn. They had watched their homeland being torn apart, and now they would finally face the enemy. The assault began at 11 p.m. on the night of May 11th with the fire of 1,600 guns. The night sky lit up, the ground shook, and at 1:30 in the morning, Polish soldiers launched their attack. The first waves immediately realized that the artillery fire had been ineffective. Ruins, craters, caves, and defensive structures had provided the Germans with perfect shelter. If they wanted to defeat the enemy, they would have to fight them face to face, chest to chest. The Carpathian Battalion advanced toward Hill 593 under heavy fire. They were taking casualties with every step. German machine guns kept spitting without pause. Mortar shells fell everywhere. But the Poles didn't stop. They kept advancing. The hill was captured, but the German counterattack came immediately after. The enemy, accompanied by mortar and machine gun fire, tried to retake the hill. The Poles defended their positions with determination. The battle continued without pause for 3 days. Every attack, every counterattack cost heavy casualties. The Poles lost 281 officers and 3,503 enlisted men. Only 800 German 4th Paratroop Regiment had managed to repel the attack of 2 divisions. The area had become a little Verdun. In the early hours of May 12, 1944, Polish infantry divisions were met with devastating mortar, artillery, and small arms fire. The lead battalions were almost completely wiped out. Advancing seemed impossible. But the Poles didn't give up. And this is exactly where Wojtek came into play. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was tasked with delivering ammunition to the front. This was an extremely dangerous job. Ammunition had to be delivered to artillery positions at the front lines, under German fire, in the dark. Wojtek had grown accustomed to the sounds of war. He had heard the explosions, the gunfire, the screams, and one night he saw his human friends struggling to carry heavy crates. He stood up on his hind legs. He cradled a 90-pound ammunition crate, and he began to carry it. Eyewitnesses describe how Allied soldiers from other units watched in astonishment. While artillery shells exploded nearby, a bear was calmly carrying ammunition crates. He didn't drop a single crate. He worked until he got tired, then took breaks whenever he felt like it, and then he went back to work. By the end of the battle, Wojtek's company had transported 17,000 shells, 17,000 tons of ammunition, 1,200 tons of fuel, and 1,100 tons of food. Wojtek's contribution wasn't symbolic, it was real, practical help. After the war, Wojtek was promoted to corporal. The 22nd Company changed its emblem, a bear carrying an ammunition crate in its arms. This emblem was painted on vehicles, flags, and uniforms, and Wojtek became one of history's most famous military animals. Subscribe and like for Wojtek. Now let's return to the role of British soldiers in this hell. British units fighting at Monte Cassino displayed extraordinary diversity. The Royal Sussex Regiment, the Essex Regiment, the Cameron Highlanders. These men came from all corners of the empire, and now they all shared the same hell. The 1st Battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment witnessed some of the bloodiest moments of the Second Battle. On the night of February 15th, immediately after the bombing, one of their companies attacked Hill 593 from only 70 meters away. But those 70 meters were hell itself. The company suffered 50% casualties. The next night, the entire battalion attacked. The result was even more disastrous. Artillery support couldn't directly target Hill 593 because the range was too close and there was a risk of hitting their own troops. Instead, they decided to hit Hill 575, which was providing supporting fire to 593. But due to the terrain, the shells had to pass very close to Snake's Head Ridge, and some shells fell among the assault units that were assembling. This nightmare caused casualties before the attack even began. The 4th Battalion of the Essex Regiment met a similar fate. In March, they captured Castle Hill, but the Germans immediately counterattacked. Coordinated fire came from the monastery, the town of Cassino, and every point in between. Essex soldiers were pinned down for 10 minutes. Then 200 German paratroopers charged down the hill. Hand grenades were thrown over the castle walls. Close quarters combat began. Calling in artillery was impossible because it could hit their own men. Moments like these defined the character of Monte Cassino. All the power of modern war technology was reduced to close combat reminiscent of medieval sieges. The Gurkhas were also an integral part of this hell. Fighting as part of the 4th Indian Division, these Nepalese warriors possessed unparalleled abilities in mountainous terrain, but Monte Cassino pushed even their limits. In March, the 9th Gurkha Rifle Regiment captured Hangman's Hill. This hill, only 300 meters from the monastery, was critically important strategically, but the Gurkhas were trapped there. Supply convoys couldn't get through under German fire. Ammunition and provisions were running out. As days passed, the situation grew more desperate. On dark nights, Gurkhas silently infiltrated German trenches. Kukri blades gleamed. Hand-to-hand, chest-to-chest battles ensued. A British officer trembles when recalling those nights. By morning, he would say, the German positions would be abandoned. No one asked what happened. But despite all this heroism, the third battle also ended in failure. The Gurkhas were forced to withdraw from Hangman's Hill. Monte Cassino still hadn't fallen. In May, the final and decisive assault was prepared. Operation Diadem involved a coordinated attack by 20 divisions along 32 kilometers. The Poles were on the right flank, the British 13th Corps in the center, and French Moroccan mountain units would move through the mountainous terrain. On the night of May 11th, the fire of 1,600 guns lit up the sky. Along a front stretching 25 miles, a deafening bombardment began. The ground shook along the Rapido Valley, and then the infantry assault began. The Poles climbed toward the monastery. The British entered the Liri Valley. The French Moroccan units captured the mountains. Every meter was paid for in blood. The battle continued without pause for 3 days. On May 13th, the French captured Monte Maio. German lines began to collapse. On May 17th, the Poles launched their final assault. Hill 593 was taken, Point 569 was reached, and on the morning of May 18, 1944, at 10:20, when Polish soldiers reached the ruins of the monastery, they made a surprising discovery. The Germans were gone. German commander Kesselring had realized the threat of Allied advances cutting his supply lines. To prevent the destruction of his army, he had ordered a withdrawal. Only 30 wounded German soldiers remained in the monastery. They were too badly wounded to be moved. The Poles weren't expecting their victory. It had happened so suddenly that they didn't even have an official Polish flag. The flag of the 12th Polish Lancers Patrol Unit was found and planted on the ruins. An hour later, General Leese congratulated Anders. Anders ordered the British flag to be raised alongside the Polish flag. It was a gesture of respect for his British allies. A Polish soldier played the traditional Krakow bugle call. At the foot of the mountain, soldiers of the Polish Second Corps sang through their tears. The battlefield presented a grim scene. Piles of unused ammunition, landmines, wrecked tanks, and everywhere the dead. Bodies of Polish and German soldiers lay side by side, sometimes locked in a deadly embrace. The smell of decomposing bodies filled the air. The cost of Monte Cassino was heavy. Throughout the 4 battles, the Allies suffered 55,000 casualties, the Germans 20,000. The town of Cassino was completely destroyed. Of its pre-war population of 20,000, more than 2,000 had lost their lives in the bombardments. Such a tragic scene, unfortunately. But victory had been won. The road to Rome was open. 2 days later, on June 4th, the Allies entered the Eternal City. And 2 days after that, on June 6th, the Normandy landings began. Monte Cassino was overshadowed by D-Day in the history books, but for those who fought there, this battle was never forgotten. These men, mockingly called D-Day Dodgers, had fought under the most difficult conditions of the war against the most skilled enemy. For the Poles, Monte Cassino was more than a victory. It was the symbol of a nation's resurrection. Monte Cassino was scratched onto walls under Nazi occupation in Poland. This name became a symbol of Polish courage. But the story doesn't end here. In the next part, I'll discuss the moral dilemma of bombing the monastery, the consequences of this decision, and what happened to these heroes after the war. General Anders's tragic end, Poland falling under Soviet domination, and what Monte Cassino means today. This final part will deeply move you. If you loved this story, subscribe and like right now. We're moving to the final part. Welcome to the final part. If you've watched this far, you understand how complex, how tragic, and how profoundly human the story of Monte Cassino is. Now I'll discuss the most controversial aspect of this epic, the bitter realities of the post-war period and the legacy that extends to this day. First, let's return to one of the war's greatest moral dilemmas, the bombing of the monastery. On the morning of February 15, 1944, the sky filled with an ominous drone. 142 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, followed by 47 B-25 Mitchells and 40 Martin B-26 Marauders, rained death upon the 1,500-year-old sacred site. 1,150 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs. Monte Cassino's magnificent white walls were reduced to smoke and rubble within hours. Allied soldiers and war correspondents watching from the valley below applauded as the bombs fell. One American soldier shouted, "Touchdown," when the last bomb hit. At that moment, it seemed like victory, but the truth was far darker. The Germans weren't inside the monastery. This information was known by many officers at the front. Brigadier General J.A. Butler, deputy commander of the American 34th Division, had stated clearly during the handover, "I don't know, but I don't believe the enemy is in the monastery." All the fire was coming from the slopes below the walls. The response from the Vatican, though ambiguous, indicated there was no significant concentration of Germans around the monastery. American Fifth Army Commander General Mark Clark was against the bombing from the start. He didn't trust the intelligence reports, but New Zealand Corps Commander General Bernard Freyberg insisted on the bombing. Finally, Clark turned to his superior, General Harold Alexander, and said, "Give me a direct order and we'll do it." And Alexander gave the order. But why? In his memoirs published 18 years after the war, Alexander wrote, Every good commander must consider the morale and feelings of his fighting men. Fighting men must know that their lives are in the hands of a man they can fully trust. This confession was striking. The bombing decision was based more on psychological need than military necessity. For the soldiers, that massive white structure was a nightmare. It seemed to be watching their every move. One soldier said, "You couldn't even scratch yourself without being watched, and it was psychological." That monastery felt alive, as if it were watching our every move. In those dark days when morale had hit rock bottom, commanders had to do something, and they did. But the results were disastrous. The bombing made the Allies' task harder rather than easier. The monastery ruins became perfect defensive positions. Piles of stone formed ideal cover for machine gun nests. Collapsed walls and deep craters provided natural fortifications for defenders. The German 1st Parachute Division, which hadn't been inside the monastery before, now settled among the rubble. Ironically, the destruction of the monastery had strengthened the Germans' hand. And the most painful truth, more than 140 Italian civilians sheltering in the monastery during the bombing lost their lives. These were innocent villagers who had fled the horrors of war and sought refuge in the sacred place. Women, children, the elderly, all perished under the bombs of their liberators. Unfortunately, such a terrible scenario had unfolded. The German propaganda machine exploited this disaster to the fullest. America and Britain were portrayed as enemies of ancient and religious traditions. The Allies had been struck by their own weapon. Military historians analyzed this decision for years. One academic study evaluated the bombing as follows. It is possible to excuse the bombing of the monastery on grounds of military necessity, but not to justify it. It is certainly not possible to excuse the manner of the bombing, as it deprived the attack of its military value and, contrary to expectations, harmed the Allied cause. This was one of the most striking examples of war's moral complexity. Right and wrong are not always clear on the battlefield. Commanders are forced to make life-and-death decisions with incomplete information, under time pressure, and sometimes even decisions made with the best intentions lead to disasters. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button. Now we're moving on to the most emotional part of our story. Please subscribe as well. Thank you. May 18, 1944. Polish soldiers planted their flag on the ruins of the monastery. Out of respect for their British allies, the Union Jack was raised alongside the Polish flag. A soldier played the traditional Krakow Haynal bugle call. At the foot of the mountain, soldiers of the Polish Second Corps sang through their tears. Victory had been won, but the cost was heavy. The battlefield presented a grim scene. Piles of unused ammunition, landmines, overturned tanks, and corpses everywhere. Bodies of Polish and German soldiers lay side by side, sometimes locked in a deadly embrace. The smell of decomposing bodies filled the air. An eyewitness wrote, "The battlefield presented a grim sight. Huge piles of ammunition and landmines were everywhere. Bodies of Polish and German soldiers, sometimes locked in a deadly embrace, were scattered everywhere. The air was filled with the smell of decomposing bodies." The total cost of Monte Cassino: Allies 55,000 casualties, Germans 20,000. The town of Cassino was completely destroyed. Of its pre-war population of 20,000, more than 2,000 had lost their lives in the bombardments. 4 months of battles had opened the road to Rome, but this road was paved with blood. 2 days later, on June 4th, the Allies entered Rome. And just 2 days after that, on June 6th, the Normandy landings began. D-Day captured all the attention. Monte Cassino was overshadowed in the history books. Soldiers fighting in Italy were mocked as D-Day dodgers, as if the real war was in Normandy while they were sunbathing. This was an unfair and cruel perception. As the Royal British Legion noted, these men had fought under the most difficult conditions of the war against a skilled enemy without the resources provided to other fronts. So what happened after the war? This is where the most tragic part of the story begins. For Polish soldiers, victory was overshadowed by bitter irony. They conquered Monte Cassino, they opened the road to the liberation of Rome, they took Ancona and Bologna, but they couldn't return to their homeland. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, three great leaders had gathered: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Poland's future was on the table. The Soviets promised free elections in liberated Poland, but this promise remained on paper. It was never kept. When the war ended, the Soviet-backed communist government began ruling Poland with an iron fist. General Anders and the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps were declared traitors and Western agents. Because they had fought shoulder to shoulder with Western forces, they had become enemies in the eyes of the new government. In 1946, the Soviet-backed Polish government revoked Anders's citizenship and military rank. Had he returned to his country, he would likely have been imprisoned or executed. Anders chose to remain in exile in England. He dedicated the rest of his life to running relief organizations for his former comrades and fighting against Soviet influence. He never saw Poland again. The land of his birth remained unreachable until his death. On May 12, 1970, General Władysław Anders passed away in London. It was the 26th anniversary of the Monte Cassino victory. His will was clear and straightforward. He wanted to be buried with his men at the Polish War Cemetery at Monte Cassino. 6 days later, on May 18th, his ashes were brought to Italy. On the 26th anniversary of his victory, he was buried alongside the soldiers he had commanded. He died in exile, but finally rejoined his men. Today, just a few hundred meters from the monastery, in the area known as Death Valley, the Polish War Cemetery rises, the final resting place of 1,066 Polish soldiers. The headstones come in 3 different shapes: Catholic crosses, Orthodox crosses, and Jewish headstones bearing the Star of David. Because the Poles who fought at Monte Cassino came from different religions, different backgrounds, but they all died for the same cause. At the entrance to the cemetery, 2 massive eagle statues stand guard. These statues, adorned with Polish hussar wings, greet visitors, and an inscription reads, "We Polish soldiers, for our freedom and yours, have given our souls to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland." If you loved this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every year, busloads of visitors come from Poland. National songs are sung. Priests conduct services. Monte Cassino has become a sacred site of Polish national consciousness. After the war, 48,000 Polish soldiers were honored with the Monte Cassino Commemorative Cross. So what happened to Wojtek? The fate of this beloved bear in many ways mirrored the fate of the Polish soldiers. When the war ended, the Polish Second Corps was being disbanded. Soldiers would scatter across the globe: England, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. For Wojtek, there was an uncertain future.